So far, we've gone over how to change the properties of elements in CSS. In other words, how to change visual elements on our web page, like the background color and the colors of our headers. Right now, we are going to focus a little bit more on the syntax of our CSS and the different ways that we can call elements and change their properties. So first, what is syntax? When we talk about syntax and coding, we are talking about the arrangement of words and symbols in a line of code. You might have heard about syntax in English class. Our definition of syntax when we are coding isn't too different from how syntax works in English or the English language, except our syntax in coding also works as a set of rules. So, computers are not as smart as humans, right? Which means that if I mess up my syntax in my code, meaning the order of which I write out my code, the computer will not be able to read or understand what I'm trying to tell it. This means that the correct syntax in coding is important to practice, and that's why we're going over it. So let's go over the basics of CSS syntax. What you're looking at on the screen is a placeholder of the elements and properties in their respected position in CSS. So we have on the screen a selector in it where it would normally go. We also have a declaration block, the property, the value, and all these extra things that build up our syntax, like our curly braces, a colon, and a semicolon. I'm going to explain more about this as we go on, so don't worry, it'll make sense soon. So let's first talk about the selector. Our selector is our target. So a question that you might ask yourself before editing the CSS and coding would be, what element or object do I want to alter or select? After deciding that, you would write it down in this format, right? You would write down your selector. So what are items that we can select? We can select all sorts of things. Some examples of elements that we can select is like our header 1, our header 2, our paragraph or P, our body, etc., and more. There's even more ways that we can select specific items, which we're going to go and get to later in these lessons. So the property. When we're editing in our CSS, the property is the thing that we want to change in our code. So for example, a common property that we can edit with our selector is like the color, the way that the text is aligned, font size, or the background color, etc. So an example of a property in real life would be like, hey, I want to change the color of my header 1, my H1. In our syntax, we would write the property that we want to edit in between the curly braces first. So next up is the value, which is the way we want to change the property and the thing that we want to edit about the property. So an example would be if we wanted to change the color of something, the value would be the color that we want to change it to, like red. Same thing with font size. Say I want to change the font size to 12. The value of the font size is 12. Text align, the way we want to align the text on the screen, the value that we would put in if we wanted to make it center is center. So all of this goes into a declaration block. So on the screen you see a rectangle, and the rectangle is surrounding the curly braces and all the words and everything that's not the selector. So this entire area inside that block is called the declaration block. So when we're coding, it's also important to note that it's common practice to indent the properties and values within the declaration block, and you're going to see CSS often in this format. It doesn't matter how many properties we want to add or customize in our code when we add a lot of properties within our declaration block, right? So for example, let's say I want to target multiple things in a particular element. I would just keep adding lines of code, right? So here we have an example of 2, here we example of 3, and sometimes you're going to even see more properties and values within your declaration block for one selector, and this is really normal. So let's go and see an example on our slides. How would I spell out that I want to make my header 1 or my H1 red? The first thing that I would want to do is select the H1 element. Right? So to do that, I would write H1 and then I would write my open and closing curly braces right behind it. And then the next step is, since I like to give myself space in my code and to format it in a certain way, I would hit return and I would leave a space and an area where I'm going to write the properties and the values. So I want to make the color of my header 1 a different color. So what I'm going to do is, can you guess? I am going to write down color with a colon, right? So now I am telling the CSS that, hey, I'm selecting my H1, meaning my header 1, and I'm letting you know that I'm changing the color to something else. And since I want to change it to red, there are multiple ways that I can call red in my CSS. The first way is to write down the hexadecimal value in my color, and this is what red means in hexadecimal value. #FF0000. We're going to talk more about what these numbers mean, but right now I'm just letting you know this is how we can call red in our hexadecimal value. Another way that we could do it is by simply writing the word red. And in both examples, you'll see that at the end of red with the hexadecimal value, I have a semicolon to finish it off. Same thing when I just write out the word red. All right, so what we have here is we have the declaration block, meaning all the things inside the curly braces. We can see that the selector or element that we are selecting is H1. The property that we are trying to alter for our H1 is the color, and the color that we want to change our H1 to is red.